Part 1, The Descent. The ground beneath my feet didn't just give way, it vanished. 1 second I was walking the familiar trail, watching the sunset colors bleed across the sky, and the next, gravity became my worst enemy. It was a sudden, violent drop into absolute nothingness. The rush of wind in my ears was deafening, accompanied by the terrifying sound of tearing roots and sliding earth. I reached out blindly, my fingers scraping against rough stone and loose dirt, trying to find anything to halt the momentum, but there was nothing to hold on to. Then came the impact. It was a brutal, bone-shaking crash that knocked every ounce of air from my lungs. I lay there in the pitch black, gasping for breath, paralyzed by the sheer shock of the fall. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. When I finally managed to look up, the world I knew was reduced to a tiny, mocking square of twilight sky, miles above my head. I was trapped at the bottom of a massive, hidden pit, completely isolated from civilization, and the realization hit me like a physical blow: nobody knew I was here. Part 2, The Assessment. The initial shock began to fade, replaced by a cold, sharp wave of panic. I tried to move my fingers, then my toes. Everything worked, but a dull, throbbing ache in my right ankle told me climbing out wouldn't be as simple as scaling the walls. I dragged myself upright, pressing my back against the damp, muddy earth of the pit. The air down here smelled different, thick, stale, and heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and ancient stone. I reached into my pocket, my heart hammering against my ribs, praying my phone had survived the fall. My fingers brushed against the cold glass. I pulled it out, and the bright screen illuminated the jagged walls around me, casting monstrous shadows. My chest tightened as I looked at the top corner of the screen: no service. I held it up, stretching my arm as high as possible toward that distant square of sky, hoping for even a single bar of signal. Nothing. I was entirely cut off, and as the last remnants of daylight vanished above, the pit plunged into absolute, terrifying darkness. Part 3, The Cold Reality. The darkness that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of light, it felt heavy, almost physical, pressing down on my chest from all sides. Without the screen of my phone, which I had to turn off to save the battery, I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face. Every sense I had was on high alert. The temperature in the pit began to drop rapidly, the daytime warmth quickly evaporating into the night air. I began to shiver, the damp cold seeping through my clothes and deep into my bones. Every small sound was magnified 100 times. A pebble trickling down the wall sounded like a landslide. A distant rustle made my imagination run wild with thoughts of what else might be trapped down here with me. I curled into a tight ball, pulling my knees to my chest to retain whatever body heat I could, staring up at the stars that were now visible through the small opening above. They felt millions of miles away, completely indifferent to the ghost trapped in the earth below them. Part 4, The First Night. Sleep was impossible. Every time my eyes drifted shut, the terrifying sensation of falling would jerk me awake, my heart racing and breath catching in my throat. The cold had become a living thing, numbing my fingers and toes until they throbbed with a dull, constant ache. I tried to rub my arms to keep the circulation going, but exhaustion was rapidly draining my physical strength. In the dead of night, the silence of the pit was broken by a new sound, the low, distinct echo of dripping water somewhere deep in the darkness. While a part of my brain recognized it as a potential source of hydration, a deeper, more primal fear took over. If it rained, this deep hole could easily turn into a death trap. I looked up at the tiny patch of sky, watching the clouds slowly roll in and blot out the stars, silently begging the universe not to let the weather turn against me. Part 5, The Dawn of Hope. After what felt like an eternity, the oppressive blackness of the pit began to soften into a dull, monochromatic gray. Dawn was breaking. I watched as the first faint rays of morning light hit the very top of the pit's opening, slowly crawling down the muddy, root-tangled walls. The return of light brought a sudden, desperate surge of energy. I couldn't just sit here and wait to be found, I had to try and save myself. I dragged myself up, ignoring the sharp protest from my injured ankle, and approached the wall. Up close, the surface was a vertical nightmare of slick clay, loose shale, and occasional thick roots dangling from the edge above. I dug my fingers into the cold mud, found a small foothold, and managed to push myself up a few inches. But the moment I put my weight on it, the earth crumbled beneath my boots. I slid right back down to the bottom, the rough wall scraping my hands and face, leaving me right back where I started, battered, exhausted, and staring up at a goal that felt completely unreachable. Part 6, The Voice in the Dark. The frustration of the failed climb left me shaking. I sat at the bottom, nursing my bleeding knuckles and fighting back tears of utter helplessness. The morning sun was higher now, casting a bright, agonizing beam of light directly into the center of the pit, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. That was when I heard it, a faint, muffled sound from somewhere far above. I froze, holding my breath so hard my lungs burned. It was a voice. A human voice, calling out an unfamiliar name in the distance. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the blinding pain in my ankle, and screamed for help with every ounce of strength left in my body. Down here. I'm down here. My voice echoed hollowly off the stone walls, sounding trapped and small. I listened intently, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. For a second, the footsteps seemed to stop. I yelled again, my throat raw and tearing. But the wind picked up, rustling the leaves above, and the distant voice grew fainter, moving further and further away until it was swallowed by the forest once more. They hadn't heard me. Part 7, The Mirage of Sound. The silence that followed the fading voice was heavier than the darkness had been. I kept yelling until my voice cracked and reduced to a pathetic, painful whisper, but the forest above remained completely indifferent. The crushing weight of disappointment settled over me, making my limbs feel like lead. I slumped back into the dirt, staring blankly at the wall, wondering if I had actually heard a person or if my desperate mind was already beginning to play tricks on me. Hours crawled by, marked only by the slow movement of the sun's beam across the floor of the pit. Hunger was now a sharp, gnawing pain in my stomach, but the thirst was worse, it felt like sand was coating the back of my throat. I looked at the dark corners where the water had been dripping earlier. The mud there was damp, but there were no pools to drink from. I was completely at the mercy of time, and every tick of the invisible clock was draining the very survival instinct I needed to stay alive. Part 8, The Inventory. With my voice completely shot and the realization that no one was actively looking for me in this specific area, I knew I had to stop relying on luck. I needed a plan. I dragged myself to a slightly drier patch of ground and emptied my pockets to see exactly what I had to work with. The collection was pitifully small, spread out on the dirt before me. There was my phone, now completely dead, its black screen reflecting nothing but my own hollow eyes. A small pack of chewing gum with only 2 pieces left. A car key, a cheap plastic lighter with a flickering flame, and a small pocket knife I always carried for camping. Finally, a crumpled receipt from a grocery store. It wasn't much. In the outside world, these items were practically junk, but down here, they were my only tools for survival. I picked up the knife, feeling the weight of the metal in my hand, and turned toward the walls again. If I couldn't climb out using the earth, would have to carve my way out, one agonizing step at a time. Part 9, The First Step. I crawled back to the steepest but most stable-looking wall of the pit, clutching the pocket knife tightly. The plan was simple, yet incredibly daunting. I had to use the small blade to dig out deep footholds and handholds into the compacted clay, creating a makeshift ladder to the top. I took a deep breath, knelt in the dirt, and drove the blade into the wall. The ground was harder than I expected, packed tight by years of pressure, and the impact sent a jarring shock up my wrist. But I didn't stop. I twisted the knife, scraping away the dirt until a small ledge began to form. It took nearly 20 minutes of grueling, repetitive work just to hollow out a space deep enough for the toe of my boot. My muscles burned, and my breath came in ragged gasps, but as I cleared the debris away from that first step, a tiny spark of control returned to me. I wasn't just a victim waiting in the dark anymore. I was fighting back. I reached up a foot higher, slammed the blade into the earth again, and began to carve the next step. Part 10, The Breaking Point. By midday, I had managed to carve out 4 distinct footholds. My arms were shaking violently from the exertion, and my hands were blistered and raw, covered in a mixture of sweat and dark clay. I decided it was time to test my progress. I placed my good foot into the first groove, gripped a thick root that dangled near the second step, and pulled myself up. The makeshift ladder held. For a fleeting second, as I rose higher above the pit floor, a wave of pure exhilaration washed over me. I was actually doing it. Then, disaster struck. As I shifted my weight to reach for the third foothold, the blade of my pocket knife hit a buried stone hidden deep within the mud. There was a sharp, metallic snap that echoed loudly in the confined space. The blade broke cleanly at the handle, and the sudden loss of leverage threw me completely off balance. The root tore from the earth, and I went crashing down backward, landing hard on the rough ground below. The broken handle rolled away into the dirt, leaving me staring at my ruined tool, completely shattered both physically and mentally. Part 11, The Darkest Hour. I lay in the dirt for a long time, staring up at the roof of my prison. The broken knife handle sat just inches from my face, a cruel reminder of how quickly hope could be snatched away. The fall had re-injured my ankle, and a dull, sickening pain radiated up my leg, making even the thought of standing up feel impossible. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, but the mental defeat was far worse. The sun began its slow descent, dragging the bright beam of light away from the center of the pit and leaving me once again in the creeping shadows. Tears of frustration and fear finally spilled over, tracking clean lines through the thick mud on my face. It felt like the pit was slowly digesting me, wearing down my resolve until there would be nothing left. Every exit was closed, every plan had failed, and as the cold evening air began to settle back into the hole, I realized that if I was going to survive, I would have to find a strength that didn't depend on tools, but on sheer, stubborn refusal to die. Part 12, The Resource. Giving up meant letting the darkness win, and as the cold crept back into my bones, a sudden spark of anger replaced my despair. I refused to let this hole become my grave. I dragged myself up onto my knees and began to crawl through the dirt, searching blindly for anything else I could use. My hands brushed against the debris from my fall, and that's when I felt it, the thick, fibrous root that had torn away from the wall with me. It was nearly 3 feet long, surprisingly heavy, and tapered into a rough, jagged point where it had snapped. It wasn't metal, but the wood was old, dense, and hardened by the dry earth. I gripped it tightly, testing its weight. It was crude, but it was sturdy enough to scrape at the clay. I crawled back to the wall, found the first few steps I had already carved, and using the jagged end of the root, I began to fiercely dig into the mud above them. The work was twice as slow and required twice the effort, but with every swing, I was hammering out a message to myself: I was still alive, and I was still fighting. Part 13, The Uninvited Guest. The monotonous scraping of the wooden root against the clay wall became the only sound in my universe. Step by tedious step, I was making progress, climbing inches higher above the pit floor. But just as the twilight began to blanket the woods above, a sharp, distinct rustling sound from the edge of the pit made me instantly freeze, my heart leaping into my throat. I looked up, barely daring to breathe. Against the fading light of the sky, a dark silhouette appeared at the rim of the hole. It wasn't a human. 2 small, glowing eyes caught the faint light, staring directly down at me. It was a wild animal, likely a stray dog or a coyote, drawn by the scent of blood and sweat. It let out a low, menacing growl that echoed terrifyingly in the confined space. I pressed myself flat against the wall, clutching my wooden stake like a weapon, suddenly realizing that being trapped at the bottom of the earth wasn't the only danger I had to face. Part 14, The Standoff. The creature at the rim didn't move. It sat there, a dark shadow outlined by the moonlight, its low growls vibrating through the cold air. Every instinct told me to scream, to throw rocks, to do anything to scare it away, but I knew that any sudden movement could cause a landslide or, worse, provoke it to fall right on top of me. We were locked in a silent, tense standoff, separated by 30 feet of vertical space. Minutes felt like agonizing hours. I kept my grip tight on the wooden stake, my muscles cramping from staying perfectly still against the damp wall. Finally, as if losing interest in the motionless shape at the bottom of the dark hole, the animal let out one last sniff, turned, and vanished into the brush. The tension left my body so fast I almost collapsed. The danger had passed for now, but it was a brutal reminder. Time was running out, and the forest was growing more hostile by the hour. Part 15, The Breaking Storm. Just as my heart rate began to slow after the encounter with the animal, the air around me changed. A sudden, cold gust of wind whipped through the top of the pit, bringing with it the distinct, sharp scent of ozone. My worst fear was materializing. Above me, the small square of sky turned from a deep midnight blue to an ominous, pitch black, completely swallowing the stars. Then came the flash, a blinding bolt of lightning that illuminated the jagged, muddy walls of my prison for a fraction of a second, followed immediately by a deafening roar of thunder that shook the very ground I stood on. A moment later, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, hitting my face like icy needles. Within minutes, the steady drizzle turned into a torrential downpour, and the walls of the pit began to glisten with a dangerous, slick sheen as water started to stream down into the darkness below. Part 16, The Rising Tide. The rain was relentless. What started as a steady stream down the walls quickly turned into thick, muddy torrents. The floor of the pit, which had been solid dirt, was rapidly transforming into a heavy, sinking soup of mud. I watched in horror as the water level began to rise around my boots, swallowing the very ground I had been resting on. The cold was blinding, freezing my muscles and making it hard to think. I knew I couldn't stay on the bottom anymore. If the water kept rising at this rate, the pit would become a watery grave. I had to climb now, regardless of the darkness, regardless of the slick mud. I lunged forward, grabbing the wall and searching frantically for the footholds I had spent hours carving. But the heavy rain had washed away the sharp edges, turning my makeshift ladder into a smooth, vertical slide of wet clay. I scrambled desperately, my hands slipping over the surface as I fought against the rising tide below. Part 17, The Slip. Desperation gave me a sudden surge of strength. I jammed my fingers deep into the eroding clay, found a thick, wet root embedded in the wall, and hauled my body upward. The rising muddy water was already at my knees, pulling at my clothes like a heavy weight. I managed to find one remaining foothold with my good foot, pressing myself flat against the slick wall as the torrential rain blinded my eyes and filled my mouth with the taste of dirt. I reached up, searching for the next grip, my fingers slick with mud. Just as I thought I had found a solid ledge, a massive chunk of the wall above me gave way under the pressure of the water. A heavy wave of wet earth hit me square in the chest. My grip tore free from the root, and I went sliding down the vertical wall, crashing heavily back into the swirling, muddy pool at the bottom. I went under for a terrifying second, coughing and choking on the dirty water, before fighting my way back to the surface, gasping for air in the absolute dark. Part 18, The Ultimate Effort. The water was up to my chest now, freezing and thick with debris. The pain in my ankle was gone, completely numbed by the icy deluge, but my body was shivering so violently that I could barely control my movements. I knew this was it. The final stand. I had no tools, no light, and no strength left, but the instinct to breathe, to live, overrode the exhaustion. As the lightning flashed again, illuminating the chaos, I saw a thick, twisted network of roots that had been exposed by the collapsing wall just a few feet above me. It looked like a solid, natural ladder leading almost all the way to the rim. Gathering every remaining ounce of life inside me, I threw myself forward through the swirling water. I lunged upward, my fingers locking around the lowest root with a death grip. I pulled with everything I had, dragging my heavy, waterlogged body out of the rising pool, determined that this would be the climb that set me free or the one that ended it all. Part 19, the final stretch. The roots were slick, slimy, and shifted under my weight, but I refused to let go. Every muscle in my body screamed in agony as I hauled myself up, inch by grueling inch. The freezing rain continued to batter my face, threatening to wash my grip away, but the rising water below was a much more terrifying motivator. I kept my eyes fixed upward, watching the rim of the pit draw closer with every agonizing pull. My hands were numb, barely able to feel the rough bark, but I used sheer willpower to force my fingers to lock around each new branch. The air grew fresher as I neared the top, away from the stagnant stench of the bottom. With one final, explosive burst of energy, I reached my arm over the very edge of the pit and gripped the solid, grass-covered ground of the forest floor. I dug my elbows into the mud and dragged my torso out of the hole, collapsing onto the wet earth, gasping for air as the storm raged around me. I was out. Part 20, The Return. I lay there in the wet grass for a long time, the rain washing the thick clay from my face and clothes. The ground beneath me was solid and flat, a sensation I had forgotten existed over those grueling, endless hours. Every breath I took felt like a victory, the cold forest air filling my lungs with the sweet scent of freedom. I had beaten the pit. I had survived the dark, the cold, and the rising water by sheer force of will. Slowly, painfully, I dragged myself to my feet, using a nearby tree for support. The storm was finally beginning to pass, the thunder rolling away into the distance as a faint, pale light began to break through the clouds on the horizon. In the distance, through the trees, I could see the flickering beams of flashlights and hear the muffled shouts of a search party calling my name. I took a deep, shaky breath, raised my voice one last time, and walked out of the shadows and back into the world of the living.